Ohio, interviewing Mr. Jack Winters. My name is Jake Fortberry. Sir, just start out by telling us what you remember about growing up, what your dad did for a living, and how it was like growing up in the Great Depression.
Well, I was kind of fortunate. My dad worked for the telephone company, Pacific Telephone, and so he had a regular job, although the hours in 1935 were cut down to 35 hours a week, but it still was good pay. So I was fortunate that way. I had two brothers. Well, I had a brother 2 years younger than me. Then in 1935 and 37, when I was 10, 12 years old or whatever it was, my mother had a girl and then a boy, which left us with two families in a way because there was a 10 years difference in them. And I went to school, Alhambra High School, which at the time I went had 5,600 students in it. My wife insists that I was antisocial because I took every science class and everything else and didn't go to all of the social activities and others. I had a couple of jobs, so that took my spare time away. I liked to go to school and I liked to study, got good grades. But the family never talked about college. And then the war came along, and actually my dad passed away the week I got out of high school. And Pearl Harbor occurred 6 months later. And I was working at the telephone company then in the switching systems like my dad had previously done, although I was just a new employee then. And a year later, I volunteered to go in the service. And in that time when I was a teenager, I had met my wife at church several years before. And so by the time I went in the service, we were engaged. But I went in and I entered the service at Fort MacArthur in San Pedro, California. They shipped me to Camp Roberts, California for radio school, and I was there for my 3 months of training as a radio operator and other things that they taught us, including firing rifles and all that basic training stuff. And the 3 or 4 days before I left basic training, they came to us and said that they wanted to put a bunch of guys in college in a program called ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program. And it was supposed to be for sophomores. I was not a sophomore, but I was willing to give it a try. And I didn't pass the test, and I shipped out a couple of days later and went to an artillery outfit in Texas. And it turned out that the captain of the artillery outfit was a reserve officer who had been activated from PT&T back east somewhere. And he had a relationship then with me because I was from Pacific Telephone. Same major company. He called me in and asked me about different things, and he said, I understand that you took a test and that you didn't pass it. And I said, yeah, it's supposed to be for sophomores, and I never been to college. He said, well, I figured that you were thinking about your shipping out, and we're a little nervous about it, so I've arranged for you to take the test over again in 10 days. And in that 10 days, I went to the library and looked up everything I could that I knew I'd had trouble with, and I passed it as a sophomore, and that got me a chance to go to college, which had never discussed in the family before, which I did want to do. And so I went to Texas A&M, and we had a lot of tests. They had tested me and decided that electrical engineering would be the right field for me to go and ship me to New Mexico A&M. And in New Mexico A&M, I took the first semester and passed it, so then my wife's mother brought her to Mesa, Arizona, halfway to New Mexico, and I met her there, and we got married, and then went on back to the college where we were able to do 2.5 more semesters. And I always laugh at the students who say that they take 16 units. It's really tough because we had to carry 30 to 32 units every 11 weeks. And if you got a C, you were kicked out Saturday. Every Saturday, 2 or 3 names were on the board, and they shipped out to the infantry. I always said that's called motivation. But I thought that was neat that I got that many semesters of college out of that, and plus the radio training. And I did get some other schools later in the Army, which I thought that was a benefit to me. They closed the ASTP program when they were getting ready to load up all the units, my understanding is, for Normandy, and then after Normandy and the war in Europe. And so they closed it about 2 weeks before the end of a semester, which really didn't make us happy because we lost our units for that semester. And so Rita went home, back to her folks' home in California, and I went to Abilene, Texas with all the other guys that were shipped to the 12th Armored Division, and immediately was sent into the signal company there. And it was interesting to note that volunteers got to pick their branch of service, and I had been a volunteer, and I got in the signal company, and this Army really was serious about it because we had the Inspector General's office come once and ask anybody that didn't get the branch of service that they wanted, and they volunteered to step forward, and those fellows were transferred to where they asked. I got what I wanted, so I didn't have a problem. I had an MOS number of Central Office Switching Systems, which they didn't have. And so when I got to Texas, they called me in the orderly room and talked to me and said, "We don't have that MOS number." Well, we need a lineman. So they scratched out my MOS number and put a new one down. Says, you're a lineman now, which was all right. It worked all right. And I joined one of the wire teams. And in about a month or two, I was able to find an apartment for Rita. It was about 6 foot 6 inches wide by 22 foot long on the side of a garage. When we pulled the bed down, the bed blocked the whole way. You had to climb over the bed to get to the back of the room. And the toilet was in the room with a partition around it, one of those standing curtains. We were there for 5 or 6 months, and then Rita was expecting, and she got so dehydrated they had to put her in the hospital. And after 2 trips to the hospital, I asked for an emergency leave and took her home. And at that time, we were beginning to pack to go overseas. And so I took her home and came back on the week after I got the 1 week furlough, and we shipped overseas. And there's some interesting stories happened. I'm not one to stand in the back corner and wait. We were getting all of this equipment packed in big crates. The radios came out of the trucks, the guns came off. All the guns and that things had to be dipped in big tanks of cosmoline, which is sort of like hot tar, but it isn't hot tar. And the summertime, late summer in Texas was hot. And the first box in the signal company got boxed and ready, and they called some lieutenant out, and he had to put big numbers on this part and little numbers up in the corner here and numbers here and all these stencils. And I paid thorough attention to that, and when he laid them down and went in the orderly room, I picked them all up. And pretty soon another box was ready, and they said, "Where's the lieutenant?" And I says, "I'm taking care of the stenciling." And for the next 3 weeks, I did all the stenciling, sat in the shade of a tree between each box. And nobody questioned it. It was being done. The lieutenant didn't seem to worry about it. Nobody did. Pretty soon they just yelled for winter, and I came over and stenciled the boxes. And another interesting little side incident was I'm too long for their mummy case sleeping bags. I could not straighten out in them. And so Rita went to town and bought duck's cloth, which is a kind of an off-white canvas. She dyed it dark brown, made me a 7 foot long sleeping bag, and sewed in several layers of flannel. And we wrapped it around one of the radios. I didn't know how I was going to get it out of that radio and be at the right spot at the right time, but we wrapped it around a radio and boxed it and shipped it out, and I carried my regulation mummy case to England. We shipped to, actually the route to New York was interesting. Because of the war, we went clear into Canada out of Texas and through Canada on the east-west track and back into New York or Pennsylvania, I'm not sure, down to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. So the tracks were so loaded going east and west. And we shipped out, I don't know the name of the ship. We shipped into Southampton. And at Southampton, I happened to be on the pier when they unloaded a couple of boxes, and one of them, they opened up the thing and my sleeping bag was in it, and I had it out of there in 2 minutes, was on my way. And I had my big sleeping bag, and it wasn't too long down in Southampton there that I met a sailor, a British sailor, and he had a most beautiful thick white virgin wool blanket that the Navy, British Navy issued him. I traded him my mummy case for that blanket, turned my sleeping bag inside out temporarily, put the blanket around it, took string and sewed it in and turned it back right, and I had that in there besides the other layers of material that my wife had put in. At any rate, we went to the Salisbury Plain Barracks. Actually, the Quonset hut we were in, they told us, was a Quonset hut that the 101st Airborne had left during Normandy landing. And we stayed there for a little while. They shipped the division then to Europe on the mainland. And there was interesting that there was a contingent of fellows that stayed behind. They had a lieutenant and one man from each outfit, one from each battalion of infantry, one from each battalion of tanks, one from each battalion of artillery and the auxiliaries. And they asked me to stay in England for a month or so with this group representing the 152nd Signal. In a sense, I wasn't representing them, but I was from them. And they sent us over to Bristol, England, and we were to find lost equipment. Every morning we got up, the lieutenant says, I got a teletype that says there's a 6x6 down in such and such a harbor, and also there seems to be 10,000 stretchers there. Two of you take a Jeep down there, one of you drive the truck back with the stretchers, and the other guy bring the Jeep back. And every day we did that all over England till we had a pile of equipment and 35, 40 vehicles of all kinds. And then we went back to Southampton. This would be a month after our outfit had got to England. And we went across the channel up to my history isn't that good anymore after this many years. I believe the Seine River, and the Seine River tides were such that we had to drop anchor for about 4 days off the end of the sandbar outside the river. And then when the tides came way up, we took the ship up the river for 2 days to Rouen and pulled into Rouen and unloaded all this, and then took the convoy clear east of Paris to catch up with our outfit. And it was getting to be, I guess it was about November by then. It was just before Thanksgiving when we found them. And then I was back with my signal company. And from then on, we were running wires, and they were in combat. And they broke up our wire teams into a wire team for the Combat Command A, a wire team for Combat Command B, and a wire team for Combat Command R Reserve, and a headquarters wire team. And I was fortunate enough to get the headquarters one. That was a little better than the combat commands, in my opinion. I went up to the front at times with a wire, but I didn't stay there. I stayed back a mile or two with headquarters company, basically. And I believe we had 2 more wire teams that were, I don't know what they did, but I think they were used where they were needed when we couldn't handle it all. And so I stayed with headquarters company wire team for the duration of the war. And our wire team was a 7-man wire team. Let's see. We had a sergeant who was over the wire team, a truck driver named Larson. It's the only name I remember anymore almost. 5, 6, 7, yeah. And 3 other fellows who did not really climb, and they also didn't like to work very much. And then Christy and I climbed. And we finally came to a mutual agreement if we did all the climbing and putting all the wires up. And we had to do that because in the tank division, if you left the wires on the ground, the tanks ran over them and cut them up. So every wire laid down had to be laid up in the air 16 foot. And so Christy and I put everything up 16 foot. The other guys ran the truck down the road and laid the wire out. We were on our own with a Jeep following the wire wherever it went, day after day, night after night. We had no hours. It isn't like civilian wartime, peacetime, I mean. We might be running wires for 36 hours, then get to sleep for 2 hours, and then they decide they got to move and run some more wires. So and we never got to the mess hall the whole time, the mess truck, the whole time of combat, because we were out running wires. We ate off the tailgate of the truck, and the particular truck we had was a 6x6. In England, we had welded big racks to hold about 100 I'm not sure how many, but like 100 big rolls of wire, and they were about 150 pounds apiece. And I apparently have lost a lot of strength because I used to grab them and throw them to my knees and throw them on the tailgate, and I couldn't do that anymore. But we also welded a rack of 2x12s, two of them, halfway down because the 6x6 is so high that you couldn't jump on it easy, but with this step up there, we could get in and out very easily. And we liberated a pot-bellied stove and put it on the tailgate. And when the temperatures got below zero, it didn't really warm us, but the two of us that climbed wore wool gloves and then leather gloves. But when you climbed one pole, the warmth of your body melted enough moisture, your gloves were sopping wet and starting to freeze. So we used to come off the pole and put our hands on the pot-bellied stove till they steamed, and then steam the back and steam the front again. Then we could climb another one because it was so cold. And we also, and since we never got to the mess truck, we took our rations and would open the little can of the C ration and so that it wouldn't blow up, and open the lid, and then we'd put it on top of the pot-bellied stove, and at least we could have warm ration on that little can. And then we also, once in a while, had to take turns at guard duty, and we always managed to liberate from the mess truck 2 or 3 loaves of bread. And they had 1-gallon cans of what they call tropical butter. It's almost like cream cheese, so it wouldn't melt when it got hot. We always kept a can of that on the truck and a can of orange marmalade. I still like orange marmalade. And we would eat the ration, and we'd put 2 or 3 pieces of toast, make toast on the top of the pot-bellied stove, and put either orange marmalade or tropical butter on it, which was cheese flavored. And that was our meals for about 6, 7 months. We just didn't have any other meals, but that kept us going anyway. I don't know, you might be interested in some incidents that occurred. We were in a long convoy. Convoys are notoriously slow, and the time, when you got them 2 miles long, when the front stops, then everybody else stops, and then the front starts, and after a while you do. We were in the woods in southern Germany, and every 15, 20 minutes, an Me-262, which was the first jet to fly in combat in the world, he'd come by with a couple of 50-pound bombs and try to drop them on some truck. And 15, 20 minutes later, here'd come another one. And one time, one lined up on us, but and the snow was 3-4 foot deep, and it was cold out. And I had my sleeping bag and a stretcher wired in the truck over the racks that held the wire, and I had the sleeping bag just wired there. I mean, my stretcher wired there permanently. I had confiscated a stretcher for my bed. And I said, I'm not getting out of this truck anymore. And Christy, the guy that climbed with me, said, we're not getting out anymore. They don't even come near us. And so we just stayed in our sleeping bags. And this particular plane picked our truck. And he dropped the bomb at about 25 foot, but we were on a hillside. And he was coming from the high side, and the bomb went over our truck about 10 foot high above it, but the ground sloped off so fast that the bomb went 30, 40 foot down the embankment before it hit the ground and blew up. And we were in the snow, and 0.2 of a second later, and all the guys said, I thought you guys said you weren't getting out. We said, well, we had a change of heart. And so we were all covered with snow again because we dove out of the truck into the snow. We went through the southern end of the Black Forest, sort of near the German border, all the way to Austria. And the war was winding down. Germans were everywhere, and they were trying to surrender, especially the Wehrmacht, the draftee ones and all. They were not real gung-ho like the SS officers. And if we weren't in a town too long, then we didn't have to run any wires. And so we were getting bored standing around. And Christian, myself, and a couple of other GIs, we found a guy who was supposedly a underground guy from Yugoslavia with an old antique rifle. He said he'd show us where Germans were down in the Black Forest, back in the back country. So we took off and got way into some of those houses that looked just like you see in the pictures. The people lived on the second floor, and all their animals were on the first floor, and they had a big farm around it in the Alps. And we were going through the house, which petrified the people. They lived pretty good out in the woods because they had their own animals and all to eat, so they weren't on rations like the rest of Germany. And they were petrified to have soldiers going through their house. And I looked out the window, and there's 6 or 7 German soldiers changing uniform, putting civilian clothes on. So I yelled at all the guys, and we dashed out there and made them put their uniforms back on, and we took them back to town. And one of them was an English teacher. He taught English. He didn't speak it real well, but he spoke it pretty well, and knew English. And we talked on the way, and they were just plain petrified. They were going to disappear and try to get home. And so we took and turned them in. Another time when the war was winding down, we captured a town. I should say the infantry and tanks captured it, and we moved in within an hour. And it had a railroad switching yard, and it had an electric engine there when all the wires had been pulled off. They hadn't damaged anything. They just unbolted all the big cables and all. So 2 or 3 of us there in our wire team that knew electricity, we wired and wired till we had the train running, and we ran it up and down the switching yard for a while. And that got a little boring, so we opened the gate and took off cross country. And we got way out in the country, and at that time in the 1940s, a farmer who lived near each road crossing had to go out and open and close the gate whenever the train came. He knew the schedule and all. And we got 5-10 miles out of the town that had just been captured, and we stopped and we saw this farmhouse, so we went in it, and it was a rather large one, and there was probably extended family in there of 2 or 3 women with a lot of kids and 2 or 3 grandparents. And that was total panic in there when 2 or 3 soldiers walked in. And I wore glasses ever since I was 9 years old, and it was cold out. And I opened a door on the first floor, and my glasses fogged over totally. And I saw 5 green uniforms, which I knew the color immediately was German uniforms. And I took my glasses off and bluffed my way by putting them up here, and I had only a pistol, and I cocked it. And it turned out that they were men who had been on the Russian front. They'd been in the town at the hospital. They were so bad off that raw bones still showed on their legs and all from freezing. And the people had hauled them out and put them in somehow got them out there and hid them in the farmhouse to get away from the war. And so actually I wasn't in danger, but I didn't know it. I thought I had really stuck my foot in it when I opened the door, and there was 5 green uniforms there, and I couldn't see. We took them out and put them on the train and took them to town, and we got a hold of the MPs and a medic, and he said he'd never seen anything so bad in his life in the way of frostbites. And then we didn't see them anymore, but at least they went to the hospital. And then we got back to town and found out we'd only been in enemy territory about 6 or 8 miles on our own. And I remember one time we got so far ahead of the lines that they had to bring gasoline into our tank column by airplane. They brought in 3 C-47s, that's the twin engine propeller job, and they had, I don't know what, 3,000-4,000 5-gallon jerry cans in each one. I don't know what it was, but it was an unlimited supply. And they brought them in just before dark with fighter plane protection. And they landed, but while we were waiting for the planes to come in, an ME-262 came in, and this particular air base was like one of the permanent military bases in the States. They had barracks for the families. The families were still there. All of the fighter planes had been flown out by their husbands before we got there, and the wives and kids were all in their barracks still. And we sort of set up a big perimeter around the whole air base to make ourselves a place for the night, which included their families and all, and we were all sitting around there waiting for the planes to come in so we could get the gas. And here comes an ME-262. He makes a pass around the field, and he puts down his flaps and he puts down his wheels, and everybody said, we're going to get one that's all intact and capture it. And about 10 foot off the ground, some guy with a trigger finger that was a little itchy pulled the trigger and shot some tracers across him, and he kept right on going. Everybody was yelling at him after that. But it was kind of interesting. And since I wasn't actually getting shot at, I had mortars come near me, I had artillery shells come near me, and once I was in an open field and an ME-109 strafed me and put tracers down both sides of me without touching me. I don't know why the shrapnel didn't, because they're explosive bullets, but I didn't get touched. But I wasn't like the infantrymen where I had it and the tank guys. And so I found that some of this stuff was very exciting, watching the German planes. And whenever we really were being bombed by Me-109s, Me-262s with their little bombs, I would go sit under a quad. If I wasn't busy and I had time, I'd run over and sit underneath a quad 50 and sit on the ground. And when you sit there, you can see the bullets going up. And I figured that's as safe as anywhere, as being out in the open, because he had a lot of guns shooting back. There was danger, and you have to be careful, but I also found it an exciting time in my life. The war ended, and then they moved us around with point system. I can't remember for sure, but in a basic idea, you got 1 point for every year you were in the service, 1 point for every year overseas, and 5 points for each child or wife you had, 5 points for each medal, like a good conduct medal and other medals. You got 5. They added them all up, and I had 89 points, I think. They moved you around to outfits so that everybody had like 80 points, another outfit had 90 points, another had 100. The highest point ones went home first, because I don't know how many they had, but they had millions of people in Europe, and they didn't have C-47s to bring them back, or 747s to bring them back, so they had to bring them back. And it took us from April, when the war ended, to December 26th. And I went to another outfit in the fall and stayed there and did nothing really, just waiting for our turn to go home. The military tried to put pressure on us to re-enlist for occupation duty. The commander of the whole outfit I went to got up a couple of times, said, if you want to get home for Christmas, you got to re-enlist. And he didn't really get any takers. We didn't get aboard till December 26th, so I don't know whether that's coincidence or real, but that's the way it worked. We had a number of, it's interesting, the different personalities. In our wire team was one fellow who had been in World War I, and he rejoined, even though he had a wife and kids, and came overseas, but he drank real heavy. And I think we were listening to a program last night or something or other where they talked about the Germans had a big gun that shot every few minutes into Colmar. And we were in an apartment house staying there for a few days till they got reorganized and got us out of Colmar. And we were on the German side of the apartment, and three of those shells lit within 200 yards of the hotel. This fellow, in his drinking continually, would watch his clock. Then he'd get nervous and run down in the basement, clear down in the basement. But then he was alone down there, and he'd watch the clock, and pretty soon and then he'd get so scared he'd run back up with us. And he did that for hours and hours, up and down the stairs. He didn't know what to do. And another interesting incident before we leave and come home occurred. Christy and I were out putting wires up and following the wire that the wire team had laid in the real bad blizzard all night long. And we got it all done and got back to where the lieutenant over the wire teams were, and he said, well, I want you to go take it all down because I don't want to have to account for it. I had you run to the wrong town. We got to run it to the right town. And normally we left it and some rear echelon guys picked it up after we moved on. But in this case, he didn't want to account for all that wire. And Christy and I were not real happy about that. So we were out climbing every pole and letting the wire down. And the wire team guys had a power pickup. They were winding it up on the truck. They were way behind us, and so we were ahead of them letting it down. And there was a large field that sloped upward away from us, and then a row of trees about 300 yards away. And Christy drank pretty heavy. I never drank in my life, but he drank pretty heavy, and he is up the pole undoing the wire, and about 3 bullets went by him. It sounded like they went in and out of him, but they didn't touch him. And I was surprised that the adrenaline sobered him up instantly for a few moments. And he only touched the pole about twice, and we were laying in the snow. And about 3 or 4 minutes later, a Jeep with a lieutenant and a Jeep driver came running along, and they saw us laying down, so they dived out in the snow too, asked us what the matter was, and we said, well, somebody's shooting at us. And so we talked it over a minute, and there was no more shooting, so Christy and I went to the Jeep and got a couple of grease guns, and we put a clip in them and fired them into the woods there. Then we reloaded and took off into the woods. The Jeep took off around the bend in the road where we couldn't see them anymore. And then I jump about 30 years ahead, and I'm at one of the reunions, and I hear a fellow telling about how he found these two signalmen laying in the snow. They dove out and talked to them, and the signalmen started to go in the woods and see if they could find who was shooting at them. So they drove around the bend in the road, and we're going to come in the woods from the other side. And this Jeep driver fellow that was talking at the reunion said, I jumped out of the Jeep into the snow, and it turned out to be a bar pit, and I went down about 4 foot and broke my leg badly above the knee. And so I ended up in the hospital the rest of the war. And he says, that German patrol there, he said, I hope they didn't give those two signalmen a bad time. And then I said, well, it wasn't really a signalman. I mean, it wasn't really a German. We found a GI out there, and he was upset because the bullets had lit all around him when we'd sprayed the woods. And he wouldn't tell us his outfit. He'd been shooting at a rabbit, and it happened to be the rabbit was on the knoll, and the bullets went right by us. And he says, I broke my leg for a guy shooting at rabbits. And so he said, now you ruined my whole story about how we were out there with a German patrol, and I broke my leg trying to help some signalmen. Anyway, we had some interesting things like that. My personality is that if I can't do something about it, I just accept it and go ahead and do it. So I can't say I was petrified all the time, although I knew I was in danger and I had to be careful. But I didn't really lose any sleep. When I laid down, I went to sleep until they woke me up. I just had the ability to do that. I thought of another interesting thing. We were on the Danube. Before we crossed the Dillingen, well, we'd captured the Dillingen Bridge intact, but we were still on the, I suppose it's the north side. I don't know that, I can't tell which, it's been so long. And we had laid wires about 5 miles down the river on a road that ran along the riverside to another town, and then in the middle of the night that wire went dead, so they got us up and told us to go down there and find it. Christy and I got in a Jeep. The Jeep happened to be quitting on us every 5 minutes, so we were out there in the dark couldn't use a light because the Germans were on the other side of the river. We were in plain sight. We finally got to the other town and pulled into the town and came around the bend, and it was a fair size. It wasn't a town that had skyscrapers, but it was a fair sized town. And we pulled around the bend, and there was about 100 German vehicles in convoy sitting there. Almost scared us out of our wits at that time. And then we realized they were empty, totally empty. Either the Germans had swam the river or they had boats and left. We found the end of the wire and found out that the outfit had moved. With a little playing around, we spliced that wire to another wire and patched it to where they were now and started back. And we were driving down the road heading back for our outfit near the Dillingen Bridge. And all of a sudden, a flame shot over the top of our truck from just a monstrous flame. And both of us dove for the floorboards for an instant, and then out of the corner of my eye, I saw 4 of the 155 Long Toms about 100 yards off the road had fired right over our head without us. I suppose they didn't know we were there, and we didn't know they were there, and the flame went right over our heads as they shot guns into Germany. The big Long Toms are like the ones on the big battleships that fired big ones, and we drove right under that flame at the instant they fired it. We got ourselves scared then for a few minutes. At any rate, we came home on the USS Sullivan from Bremerhaven, Germany. December 26th, we left the harbor, and we went down through the North Sea into the English Channel to go south because it was wintertime, to go across the Atlantic, not being so far up. And off the cliffs of Dover, with a monstrous storm they were having up in the North Sea, the wind started rolling the boat so bad that they had taken a Liberty ship. The USS Sullivan was a Liberty ship. They'd converted it to a troop carrier, and they had put the mess room in the part of the bunk area that I was in. I was on a top bunk looking right down on everybody eating in the middle of the room, and they had stand-up tables. In a troop ship like that, you stood up, put your legs apart, grabbed your tray with your hand, and hung onto the table and ate with one hand. And it was really rolling, and all of a sudden the ship rolled so far over that all of the fellows fell down. They no longer could hang on. We were clear up over 50 degrees up on the side. The kitchen had big kettles were in safety rings, and even the kettles fell out of the safety rings. Everything came apart. And then the ship rolled back level and rocked, but it didn't submerge. And it's one of those things. 2 or 3 guys got sick with all the food all over them, and then everybody else in the whole thing was sick. On troop ship, a lot of people wouldn't know, but you only got 2 helpings a day and no seconds. And I eat an awful lot of food, and I just have a high metabolism, I guess. And so after an hour and a half, the merchant marine fellows cleaned up the whole mess, and they opened the kitchen again, and only 6 of us showed up. So I got to have about 3 helpings then, and I enjoyed that. It was very stormy coming home, and that Liberty ship was just the right length that out in the middle of the Atlantic, the nose would go up in the air and over a large crest, 20 foot high, big swell, and then it would teeter over it, and the nose would be down on the next swell, and that would be completely submerged with green water hitting the bridge. And then it would slowly rise up, and we'd teeter over the next one. We did that for several days, and my bunk was right near the single wall hull, and I could put my hand on it, and every time we submerged with the bow, I could feel the steel move in, and then it moved back out again when we went up in the air. It was a rough ride, but we came into England, to New York, and we're there for 2 days, and I was put on a I guess a DC-4. It's been so many years. That's a 4-engine job that's like the DC-3, but with 4 engines. We landed at Tulsa, refueled in the middle of the day, and landed at Long Beach Airport. They took us up to Camp Fort MacArthur, where I went in at San Pedro. Said, if you guys hurry, we'll process you. You can have passes tonight. So we hurried. And I got a streetcar into LA, and I got a streetcar out to Monrovia, where my wife lived. And I got a taxi and walked into 11 at night, and they didn't know I was coming. I had done that intentionally. I had written her 10 times saying, I'm coming, and then they'd tell us we're not coming. Then I'm coming, and we're not coming. So this time, most of the guys phoned, and I just walked in the door. Her dad was sitting in the kitchen, and I walked in. The whole neighborhood got up. It was really exciting. My wife had been pregnant when I took her from Abilene home on the emergency leave. My little girl was 1 year old when I got home. And I always kid. They used me as a boogeyman, I say. She denies it. They used me as a boogeyman because every time I got near her, she screamed for about 6 months. She didn't want nothing to do with me. But she got over it. And she was a very good girl, and she's 53 now with her own 5 kids, and they're all in college or married. So we got over that little boogeyman episode. At any rate, those are the things that happened to me and the war. And I over and over tell people that they do not realize what Europe was after the war. Towns, we're in Columbus, Ohio right now, and towns this size I saw that were no more than rubble 10 to 15 foot high. There was no electricity, no water system, no postal system, no businesses running, no stores open. The people were in dire straits, and I think America was pretty nice to them when we took care of them after the war and got them on their feet, in a sense, with the Marshall Plan. I also made comments to many people when I've come home that I heard a lot of people say that they don't think England did their share. And I got a pass from the Salisbury Plain to London for 3 days, and I rode for an hour through suburbs that were flattened by the V-bombs and the, I forgot the other one, the big one. But at any rate, those people put up, and I was in a theater in downtown London when a V-bomb hit the other end of the block we were in. The theater kept right on going. They fought the fire at the other end, the show went on. And I think that the British did their share. That's what my opinion was, because they really took a beating and they just kept right on hanging in there. At any rate, I don't have anything else that I can remember. We have ultimately raised 6 of our own children, 2 boys and 4 girls. My wife's kid sister died, and she had two little kids, so we took them and raised them. We have 23 of our own grandchildren, and some of those are married and got great-grandchildren now, and two kids we raised have, I guess, 6 more grandchildren and theirs, which we count. That'd make 28, 29 then. And so we got a big family out of what we started.
What do you remember about VE Day when you were over there?
VE Day, we were still packing in Texas. The whole division was.
Victory in Europe?
Oh, Victory in Europe, pardon me. I'm thinking of Normandy.
Yeah.
Yeah, VE Day. It was not the celebration that everybody over here had, or from what I see on the papers and all. We just were relieved and could settle down and quiet down. It was no big celebration. Nobody was waving their hats or anything. We just wondered what we had to do now. And actually, quite a bit of rumors occurred that we had to pack and go to Japan, or to Middle East. And then those rumors kept going for weeks. And finally, when Japan surrendered, we even had that load off of our back, and we didn't have to worry about it anymore. And I understand some fellows actually got headed towards Japan, but we didn't. We were just worrying about it. Another thing I just remembered. The division's credited with 68,000 prisoners or some figure like that. As the war was winding down, Christy and I one day went out with a Jeep. Excuse me. Christy and I went out with a Jeep into the Austrian Alps. And we come around a bend. Well, we come around the bend, and there's about 60 or 80 German soldiers marching to cadence with an officer counting cadence down the street. And we were committed right in the middle of them before we could do anything. And I had a pistol, Christy had a carbine, and we told them they were captured, and somebody that understood English said, yeah. And they didn't have any knives, they didn't have any bayonets, and they didn't have any guns. They had prepared to surrender. And we marched them for a couple of miles back with the Jeep at one end and me or the other fellow walking at the front of the column all the way until we found a railroad detachment and turned the men into a lieutenant there who wasn't too happy to have them all, with about 5 railroad detachment guys. That was their job, to get the trains going some way. And then I mentioned the time we were in the woods and found 5 or 6 Germans and took them in. We turned them into some outfit that was not our 12th Armored. So I'm sure that there are many more captured that didn't get credited. They were officially 68, but I know that with the 60 or 80 that we didn't turn into our outfit, they didn't get counted. So at least for our unit. So I bet we captured a lot more than 68,000.
What do you remember about the German people as civilians, like during the war and then during the occupation?
I've talked to several Germans during the war and afterwards, and many of those thought Hitler was their savior. He had taken them out of the Depression and helped them out, and they were worried about what did we do with their leader, Hitler. On the other hand, I one day was laying wires, and alongside of the road was these steel transmission towers with high voltage at the top, the big ones, 100-foot high, And we looked down there, and if we went up and used the tower about every 300 foot, we would be able to lay the wire there instead of in the woods, which is hard to do, laying them on limbs and everything. So we went up there, and I climbed halfway up the transmission tower, and I just started up a ways, and some farmer came out of the woods, German, and he told me in German and cautioned me that that was very dangerous up there. And even though the war was on and I was an enemy, he told me it was dangerous to climb a pole. So most of the civilians were not radical, and they were friendly in a sense. I had a real interest in another incident in Alsace-Lorraine, and that's a little different. Alsace-Lorraine was an area that, part of it anyway, where the Germans came in, I think in 38 or 37 or somewhere like that, and then made them speak German. And we had just cleared that. That's not too far from Herlisheim. And we had just cleared that area, and it was Christmas time. And so our wire team went to this house in Allied territory. We were told to ask if we could use a room for the night, not just barge in and kick them out. And we asked them if we could come out of the cold, although they only heat their kitchen. Even today, we've been back, and they only heat the kitchen in little towns. But at least we were out of the outside weather, and they gave us a bedroom to put our wire team on the floor there. And it turned out to be Christmas Eve. That afternoon was Christmas Eve. Christy and 3 or 4 of us were nothing to do, and we were talking to this housewife as best we could. She spoke French and German, and we spoke English, but we did some. She didn't have much food, and she didn't have any gifts for the kids. And we managed to get the understanding was that there was a French farmer down the road who was a collaborator with the Germans. So Christy and I got in the Jeep and drove down there, and we sort of scared him with the guns. And he came up with a goose and some potatoes and turnips and some other things like that. And we came back, and she cooked a big meal for her husband, who had just escaped from a German work camp, and her kids and us. And we had a big meal in the evening. And Christmas Eve is the big time there. And they got a different tradition than we do on Christmas. And a lady comes, and I don't even know the French name for her, but she had what would be like a wedding dress on, all white, with a veil on so you couldn't see her face, and a tiara on her head, all white and all, and she had a big willow. And she came to the front door, and the little kids, it was sort of like Santa coming to the front door, and she came to the front door, and they invited her in, and she lined everybody up, and the little kids lined them all up, and a couple of us soldiers snickered and did things, and she switched us for not moving promptly, and the kids thought that was great. And we had given the mother some of our candy bars out of our packs and rations, and she had those. And their tradition, she left them with instructions to memorize certain scriptures out of the Bible, and she wanted them to recite them to see that they'd learned them. And if they faltered, they got a switch. And then they went on some more and got another switch, and if we snickered, we got a switch. And after the whole episode done of reciting their scriptures and all, then she got out her candy bars and gave it to them. And I really wanted to find that family, and we went back 6, 7 years ago, and I spent days looking for that place, and I could not find it. And I wanted to maybe take some things to them, because they gave us Christmas. It was real interesting. And I really wondered what happened to them, because they were really nice to us. They had just the one room heated, and they had one carbide lamp, a little tank with a little bit carbide gas coming out. That's the total light they had in the house.
I don't have any other questions. Can you think of any, Judy? And if you don't have anything else, that's all I really think of, Jack. It's blinking.
A thought that came to me while we were in occupation duty. I was sent to Paris from Germany, and I went to a microwave antenna radio school for 2 weeks. And it was, since the war was over, we just had regular business hours in school, so we had every evening off to go to Paris in town. And I got to go to the Louvre, and I spent 2 days in there because I like to read every single label. I never did see all of it, but I was able to take my family back, at least my wife and youngest son back 5, 6 years ago, and we went and spent part of the day there again. The microwave antenna was interesting that I never used that particular schooling, but oftentimes in my job, I needed to understand the fellows that worked on them and understand the theory of them, and also I did have the schooling, even though I didn't have to actually use it, but I could speak with those that needed to. And I came back, and I had worked for Pacific Telephone Company before I went in. They kept my job open. They gave me my raises that I would have got for the 39 months I was gone, and I came back and started there with them. I worked in the switching systems there for quite a while. I became a foreman over a part of the office, and then I changed to general telephone and electronics. And I went back to school and finished an AA degree in electronics. They knocked so many of my units off from New Mexico A&M that I hardly had any left. And I had 3 kids by then, so I got an AA in electronics, which the company was real impressed with. They actually told me that when I got my AA, they'd put me in management, and they did within 30 days. I also got an industrial supervision certificate in California, which is a recognized certificate. They have a certain number of requirements of credits and all, and the company wanted that. I took things that I needed for the company to benefit me more than just to get a degree, although I'd like to have a better degree. And then I also got a Class D teaching certificate to teach in college. Class D is limited to one subject, electronics, because that was my major and I had so many years in it, and that was the requirements, plus some classes I had to take. And so I taught for about 10 years at Cerritos College, 1 or 2 nights a week, teaching basic electronics and electricity and subjects, and it was actually a captive audience. I announced it at work, and everybody in my class was from work. And I enjoyed teaching. I taught for 10 years on switching systems with a telephone company, and I think that's the best part of my life, was teaching all those circuits. I like the circuits. I like the electronic stuff. I'm totally obsolete now. All of the equipment I work for is pulled out, and they've got some little stuff in a corner called electronics. It does everything we did in 3 stories in an area about 1,000 square foot, where we used to have 3-story building with all the equipment. I know nothing about it, but because they put the first one in when I retired, the year I retired. But I did get the 3 educational things that would benefit me in the telephone company. I guess that caught up with what I was thinking. Forgot to mention.
Okay,